What's the perfect shin angle for velocity? Max Wardell, overheadathletics.com. We're talking about shin angle, and I kind of want to talk about what shin angle actually is. So first of all, shin angle, or the way it's commonly referred, refers to the angle here of the shin as a pitcher drives down the mound. So just looking at the angle relative to the ground of this back shin, this drive leg shin. There's a lot of confusion about this. There's kind of two camps that are looking at different shin angles and trying to attribute certain velocity profiles or injury profiles to these athletes. And I don't think that's completely correct. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly goes into shin angle, and then let's look at a few pros. I first want to address the idea that shin angle is completely indicative of your injury risk and velocity profile, because it's simply not true. As you throw, your shin angle is going to be largely dependent upon your hip rotation, not just how much you access, but also how much your anatomy allows you to move, your foot pronation, how collapsed or not collapsed or rigid your arch is, then also how well you sequence the early phases of the throw to allow you to express velocity. So there's a camp out there that advises a shin angle, whether they call it a negative shin angle or whatever they want to call it, positive shin angle, where the knee drops in. And so the idea being that you kind of kick out and around and do a maneuver like that and collapse through. Well, you can utilize gravity to pull you this way, but you don't get much effect of your gluteal muscles, your hip abductors, or even your quads. What ends up happening is you're using gravity to accelerate you forward, which is really inefficient, and you lose a lot of power. You see that this isn't what the best elite athletes in the world do. Let's take a look just for a second here at Aroldis Chapman, fastest pitcher in the history of baseball. I don't see him doing that. He's kind of in between that vertical shin angle and a shin angle that's in a positive position where it's leaned forward and collapsed. So this idea of collapsing the shin and then trying to give some hypothetical score based on that is rubbish. I've had athletes that have gone to an instructor that gives them a score based on some sort of score, I don't know, based on their mechanics. I have them move their foot from being flat on the mound to halfway on the rubber, and their score improves by 3 or 4 marks right away. They did nothing to change their mechanics, they just went like this. When they went like this with their foot, their knee collapsed in sooner. So they went from here and they collapsed in sooner, and then their score goes up. So I don't put too much precedent in those scores, especially when they're not validated in any reliable journal. But as far as shin angle, let's look at a couple pros here. So we saw Chapman, and we saw that his shin's neither vertical nor really inclined towards the target or pointing towards the target. Let's look at Greg Maddux. All-time great, one of the best ever. You can see that his shin, once again, is kind of in that mid-range where it's not immediately collapsing forward into that valgus compromised collapsed position we just talked about, and it's also not straight vertical. So a lot of these programs out there, well-intentioned, looking at pros and saying their shin remains more vertical, it's not really vertical. So this vertical shin ideal isn't quite correct either. What we see in a lot of our pros is they're somewhere in between. They're in that middle range where you can produce the most amount of power. And this range depends a lot on your hip anatomy. As I load into my hip, that's gonna dictate what really happens later on in the throw. So if you look at what I'm doing here, if I kind of load into my hip a great extent, you'll see that my shin is slightly more vertical. So the more hip load I have this way, the more vertical this shin is going to be. But somebody that doesn't have very good hip internal rotation around this way, which is what happens as I load, and I've heard this too, that this is external. This is internal rotation because my pelvis, my hips rotated on top of my femur. So hip internal rotation, if I don't have very good hip internal rotation, my knee is either going to deviate too far out, or I'm never going to load and I immediately fall in this way. Depending on how much rotation I have, that's going to change how much hip load I have. For the majority of us who have kind of normative ranges of hip motion, as you load into your hip, as long as you turn your hips properly and at the right time, you'll find that you access the correct amount of angle of your shin relative to the floor and relative to your foot. One of the things that I see happening all the time is that we either overdo it one way or overdo it another way. So we kind of want to control for that. So I'm sitting down here to show you guys, as I evert or bring my foot and knee in, what happens is my knee immediately collapses in. If my knee collapses in, my pelvis rotates open. So as soon as my foot collapses in, my knee collapses in, my hips start to open up towards the target, often prematurely. What happens in our elite level throwers is they hold rotation away, so their shin remains somewhere in this mid-range position a little bit longer, and then they access that rotation later in their throw. If I initiate my throw with a collapse, I end up in a bad position. Likewise, if I drive out and try to verticalize my shin here, what happens is I can roll off the inside of my foot, and now I'm trying to push sideways that way off the outside of my foot, and I can't do it. So let me show you one more time here. If this foot collapses in, my knee will roll in and my hips will roll there. Now, if you feel your glutes in this position, you'll feel they're dormant, they're off. Even if I have my weight on that foot, you'll feel your glutes are pretty much off. Now, if I do the opposite of that and turn away, you'll feel that your glutes are really on. You can poke right into those glutes and feel they're on. So I feel my glutes are on as I'm going. However, if I try to overly drive this shin vertical, what you'll see is the inside of my foot lifts off, and now I can't push laterally. So neither is good. We have to avoid the extremes here, just like we see in most of our pro players. You already saw Chapman, you saw Greg Maddux, two antitheses, I would say, the control pitcher and the power pitcher, and they both do pretty similar things with that shin angle being at relatively middle range, but allowing for their hips to become loaded. On top of that, let's look at one of the best power pitchers in today's baseball, and I don't even like to call him a power pitcher because he has some really good stuff as well, and he's a gamer, and that's Jacob deGrom, and we see that he's in kind of a similar range too, where there may be 20 to 30 degrees off of vertical as he starts to go, and then as he comes out of his hip load much further down the mound, he drives that leg inward and opens his pelvis up towards the target. You'll see the same thing in one of the greats all time, Roger Clemens, one of the best power pitchers of all time, phenomenal mechanics. Once again, see he's in a great position. His shin is angled towards the target, but only so much as to allow him to generate good linear acceleration and momentum towards the target, but also because he's rotated away from the target, his shin is relatively up and down. There's two of the best. We've seen it, you've seen it. Shin angle. I think this discussion is pretty much covered. If you guys like this video, hit the thumbs up. Make sure you check out our programs. Check out the link in the description with the discount code, and check out any of our biomechanics programs, our strength and conditioning programs. We'll see you guys in the next video.